'Cause he gets up in the morning and he goes to work at 9, and he comes back home at 5:30, gets the same train every time. And he's all so healthy in his body and his mind. He's a well-respected man about town, doing the best thing so conservatively.
Bob Weide, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, thank you.
Bob, you created, wrote, and produced this amazing series that is called Mr. Sloane. I love it. Many of my colleagues love it.
Do you have any colleagues who don't? Because I'd like to speak to them.
No,
find out what the problem is
I don't know, unless they've lied to me.
So all of your colleagues?
All of my colleagues who've seen it just absolutely love it.
Good.
We have a lot of viewers, though, who are wondering, tell us, what is Mr. Sloane and what is it about?
Well, Mr. Sloane is a bit of a sad sack fellow living in a town called Watford, England, which is about maybe 30 miles outside of London. In 1969, when we first join him in the series, he's at the end of his rope, literally and figuratively. Things aren't going well for him. He's a guy who really likes continuity in his life. He's not a big fan of change. And he's an accountant, so he works with numbers. He likes problems that can be figured out on a ledger. And his life is very routine, the same train every morning and coming home at 6 and dinner on the table and then meeting his friends at the pub. And then one day, we learn in flashback, the rug is pulled out from under him. He loses his job and his wife leaves him on the same day. So the series takes place sometime later. He's floundering, he's trying to find his way back on his feet, and things aren't going so well for him. Comedically, of course, is how we handle this. And we see him with his friends at the pub, and everybody seems to be doing very well except for him. And he's trying to sort of maintain his composure and a happy-go-lucky spirit, but we know he's in pain. And in the first episode, there's a possible job that comes his way and possibly new romance that comes his way. So over the course of the series, we see this guy trying to right himself and get back into the swim of things, and things don't always go his way.
So the series, you said, is set in 1969 in Watford.
Right.
That would make it a British series with, I assume, a British cast.
Right.
And first, let's talk about this wonderful cast you assembled for this series.
Well, the star of the show, who plays Mr. Sloane, is Nick Frost, who's a wonderful actor who can do comedy and drama. And I wrote the show specifically for him. Nick and I were friends. I happened to work in England a lot and did a feature film with his buddy Simon Pegg a few years ago called How to Lose Friends and Alienate People. So through Simon, I met Nick. And Nick is just a great actor, and this was a part I thought of for him. And it was such a delight to write this, because as I was writing the scripts, I was continually chuckling to myself, not at how brilliant the writing was, but just imagining Nick delivering these lines and knowing that he'd sort of hit it out of the park, which he did. So this part was tailor-made for Nick Frost. The part of his, not quite ex-wife, but his separated wife, Janet, is played by Olivia Colman, who is becoming a national treasure in England. She's won 3 BAFTA awards now. Again, somebody who is equally adept at comedy and drama. And Olivia and I have been friends as well, so I wrote this part for her. Unlike Nick, who knew I was doing this, Olivia didn't. So basically, once I finished the pilot script, I sent it to her and I said, I wrote this part for you and I really hope you'll want to do this, and she did. And the rest of the actors were all cast sort of the conventional way through auditions. Peter Serafinovich, who plays Jeremy Sloane's friend Ross, is somebody that I knew and was friendly with. Thought he might be great for the role, asked him if he would come in and audition. He did, he was wonderful. And the other actors I hadn't met prior to the audition, but really lucked out. A fellow named Laurie Lewin, who plays Beans, another one of his mates, one of his pub mates. And Brendan Patricks plays his sort of playboy friend, Reggie, who's also, it's a part that fits him like a glove. And the other big discovery was an actress with quite a mouthful of a name, Ophelia Lovibond. She actually sounds like a Bond girl. It sounds like a fictional Bond character, who plays an American girl from San Francisco named Robin in the show. And first of all, she's a great actress, but on top of that, her American accent is so spot on that when we had our first read-through with the other actors, whom she hadn't met before, other than Nick, they all assumed that she was American. So after the read-through, when she was speaking to them in her normal British accent, they thought she was putting on the British accent, not realizing she'd put on the American accent. So she's wonderful. She's sort of my discovery in this show, Ophelia Lovibond. And that's basically my cast. There's a woman named Valerie Lilly who plays the neighbor, Mrs. Wyndham, who has a dog who's not a big fan of Sloane's. And some other very popular British actors like Kevin Eldon has a bit of a cameo scene. So there are a lot of actors that may not be familiar to American audiences, but are very familiar to British audiences. And they're all, I really lucked out with this cast.
So we're missing a big beat here. Set in 1969 in Watford, England, English cast, English sensibility, and you are from?
Orange County, California, about 50 miles from where we're sitting right now.
So how does?
And I was 10 years old in 1969.
So how do we get to come up with a series set in this other time, in this other land?
Part of me wants to answer, I have no idea. I don't really know how this happened. The concept for this show was the closest thing to sort of automatic writing that I've ever experienced, where the idea just sort of poured out of me all of a sudden. As far as the more narrative reasons for the time and place, I wanted Jeremy Sloane to be sort of this very buttoned-up conservative guy. He is an accountant. He has glasses, sort of like you and I are wearing now, these sort of horn-rimmed glasses, very conservative haircut, very conservative guy. And I thought the idea of putting a guy like that in the so-called swinging 60s, near London, where supposedly everything is happening, but there's nothing swinging about his life, I thought that was sort of interesting. And there's a cultural revolution going on. People are getting high. People are listening to a new kind of music. People are, women are sort of finding themselves and all that. And this guy has nothing to do with that. That's all passing him by. So the question was where to put it, because I didn't want to put it in central London. So, there are all these little satellite towns around London that are in many ways, light years away from London. And I picked the town of Watford, especially after visiting Watford, where not a lot has changed. And this isn't a put down of Watford, it's actually a quaint little town, but you speak to people who grew up in these towns during that time and they say, oh yeah, we heard about the swinging 60s, but that was over there. Our lives didn't change, we were just in the pub every night or watching telly or whatever. So I wanted to set it in that time, and some of the issues that come up in the show, like Robin, this young sort of hippie from San Francisco, gets Sloane to try pot for the first time. Meanwhile, Sloane's wife has left him to find herself. These were all the kinds of stories that to me were better suited at that time than in the present time.
Each of the episodes has at least one terrific visual, physical, clever, laugh out loud moment that I don't want to give all of them away, but it's
no, let's do it. Let's list them all.
Okay, let's go through the whole plot. Okay.
They can decide whether or not they like it.
Did you deliberately say, I want to have a moment in each one that you're going to remember? I mean, I'll give away, episode 6 has Piggly Wiggly, where Sloane has to take a temporary job, and it's the most demeaning, terrible job, and he gets set upon by these kids, and it's absolutely awful, and it's absolutely hilarious.
Yeah.
That's just indicative of every episode having that kind of a moment that is a defining comedic touch to it.
Well, I like comedy that comes out of humiliation. I like taking a character that we like and we root for, and you sort of dangle a carrot in front of him, and he thinks, oh, things are going to be okay, and then you drop him off a cliff. I just personally like that as a comedic structure. So there's quite a bit of that in Sloane, where things seem to be finally going his way, and then, the bottom just falls out. So that's really where that came from. And I suppose there is sort of that moment in every episode. The particular scene that you're talking about, and a lot of those scenes, when I sold the show in England initially, I just wrote the pilot script on spec, meaning I wasn't commissioned to write it, I just wrote it on my own with the idea that I would sell it afterwards. So all I had was the pilot. And the network in England that picked it up, Sky, bought the series based on the pilot. And I thought, well, now I've got to create the stories for what follows the pilot. I had a basic outline in mind where I wanted Hidden to end up at the end. That's sort of the first thing I came up with, was the very opening scene of the show and the very closing scene of the show, 6 episodes down the road. So now I had to sort of fill in those gaps. I had rough ideas, but it was just a matter of sitting down with the idea and letting my imagination take over, and those scenes just sort of happened.
Scene 1, episode 1, is just an amazing moment. Dark, and funny at the same time.
Yeah.
What inspired you? I don't want to give it away.
Right.
But what is it that inspired you to come up with that?
Well, I wanted to open with this guy at his lowest possible point because, from where we start off with Sloane, there's nowhere to go but up. And I wanted to sort of, again, paint the idea that he's at the end of his rope. Take that how you will. And, but then suddenly there's a phone call from one of his mates saying, hey, we're down at the pub, come join us. And he says, okay. So it's sort of like life goes on. That was sort of the point of that scene, was that as bad as things get, when you think, okay, I can't take it anymore, a friend calls up and says, hey, come down to the pub for a drink, you're late. All right, you go. So that's sort of Sloane's life. He's sort of going along for the ride, and every time he thinks he can sort of, have control over his destiny, it doesn't quite work out that way. And it's like, okay, I'll play things the way I always have. So that was sort of where that came from.
Great use of music in the opening titles, throughout the show. You must love music.
Well, it's interesting because I wanted Sloane to be a man out of time. We were talking about how he's living through the swinging 60s, but he's not experiencing it. Now, I sort of have a passion for Gilbert and Sullivan, which is long before any of our time, and even long before Sloane's time. I'm not a big aficionado. I don't know everything about them, but I've come to enjoy their work quite a bit. So I thought it'd be interesting to have this guy, again, during the swinging 60s, and he's still listening to Gilbert and Sullivan. So there's a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan in the show.
And there's a great line, by the way, that somebody asks him, oh, I know Gilbert Sullivan.
Oh, yeah. Robin says, who's this music? And he says, Gilbert and Sullivan. And she says, oh, I've never heard of him. But again, with her emergence in his life, there's actually a scene where she comes over to his house and brings over some contemporary music, puts on a Kinks record. And he says he's sort of heard of them. And she says, what about the Beatles? Ever hear of them? And he goes, oh yeah, there's 4 lads from Liverpool. I've read something about them in the papers. So there's a mix of a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan music, which to me is an incredible sort of soundtrack for the film, and then contemporary music finding its way in as well. That's sort of the dichotomy that he's living at that moment.
So you said
I should say a lot of Kinks music.
I was about to say.
Yeah.
And the fantastic.
Opening, well, the opening theme to the show is A Well-Respected Man, which Kinks fans will recognize. And I, like everyone else now, I have my iPod and everything I run with, and it's usually on random play, and I don't know what's coming up. And as I was thinking about the series, thinking through the idea, I was running one morning with my iPod, and I heard A Well-Respected Man. I said, this is Sloane. They're singing about my character. I've got to get this song for the opening credits. And it wasn't an easy song to get, but we got it, and I sort of imagined the whole opening credit sequence, and it came together ultimately much like it popped into my head at that moment. So yeah, Mr. Sloane is the well-respected man.
Did Ray Davies ever see the series?
I don't know. I'd be interested to find out. I hope so, because there's a lot of his music in it, and I would like to think he'd be very pleased by it.
Great pieces of music that underscore the theme of what's going on in Sloane's life.
Right. The music is there as score and as music, but often the music is making some other point about the action that's taking place. If you're lucky, things line up that way.
So you said you created a show in your head that you knew where it was going to start and end. Then, as often happens in life, there's a little twist. You get critical reviews. People love the show. Just when you thought it was done, the network is saying, more please.
Yeah.
What was your feeling at that point?
I may be the only guy who makes a living the way I make it, who gets annoyed when people want more work from me, because I basically have no work ethic. And once I finish with something, I just want to take a good nap or go away somewhere. And when people say, oh, we want to renew your series, I take that as sort of a slap in the face. But that's just me. No, so I sort of conceived this story as a contained story. I had the beginning, I had the end, I filled out the middle. I told the story about Mr. Sloane that I wanted to tell. And, but it aired, it did very well for the network, and then suddenly people were saying, well, what about a second season, or as we say in England, a second series? And I thought, oh, isn't that enough? I like where I left Sloane. Let's leave him alone. Let's leave him there. And they said, no, we would really like a second series. So I said, all right, but I have to be inspired by an idea. I can't do it just to do it because everybody wants one. I have to think hard about where to take this guy. And then I started to think about it, and I thought, yeah, I could do a second series. I think I know what to do with him and his mates and the girl and the ex-wife, and how I can sort of take this further. And so I wrote up a fairly general kind of outline as to where a second season would go. And then, as happens very often here in the States, somebody new came to the network who decided not to carry on with the show, to create some new shows and to start with a fresh agenda. So I was let off the hook, but at the same time, by now I kind of thought, well, now I'd sort of like to continue this show. So it's actually fine with me. The people who are very annoyed are the fans, and there's quite a few in England.
Like one right here?
Oh, well, yes,
Okay.
You've been very kind. You've been a supporter from very early on. But, you know, there's a Facebook page for Mr. Sloane, and there's a Twitter account for Mr. Sloane. And still, every day I get people saying, what about a second season? What about a second season? We want to know what happens to this guy. And finally I had to put up a big announcement saying there's no second season. And so there are a lot of very upset Mr. Sloane fans in England, which hopefully now there'll be upset Mr. Sloane fans in the States.
Could you tell us what could have, would have, should have happened in season 2?
The tricky part is talking about season 2 without revealing too much about season 1. I will say that Sloane's status with his mates, which we see during the course of the series, abruptly changes at the end of the first season. So there was a question about sort of how to get the band back together again for the second season. And there are other characters who sort of are in his life and out of his life that I sort of dismissed at the end of season 1 that I had to find out ways to get back. There's so many loopholes in my explaining it. It would, I think, only confuse people to know. But if the British network ever changes their mind, or if another network chooses to pick it up again, everyone can see what happens in a second season.
Terrific. Now you have been involved with another amazing, amazing series. And I'd love you to tell us the creation and what has made Curb Your Enthusiasm such a unique comedy. It's in its own class. It's not a comedy per se.
Yeah. Well, I think Curb Your Enthusiasm sort of sticks out for the very reason that it was unique, for the reason that neither Larry David or I really knew what we were doing. I mean, Larry obviously had come off of, 7 years on Seinfeld, so he knew what he was doing as far as putting a TV show together. But this was a unique way of doing things because, as is now widely known, the series wasn't really scripted. There was always a story outline, a very detailed story outline, but dialogue was improvised and made up on the spot. And this was a new way of doing television. People have attempted it since, but at the time this was sort of groundbreaking. So we were just sort of flying by the seat of our pants. And, just filming each scene different ways, as the actors would go a different way with their improvisation, and then going into the editing room with a lot of footage, and sort of continuing to structure the story in the editing room, because there are all these kinds of narrative choices you can make. So, it started off as a 1-hour special. Larry actually called me up. I've known Larry since the early 80s. And he called me up out of the blue. I remember it was October of 1998, and said he had an idea for an HBO special that would be shot sort of documentary style. And he had the basic idea of what to do with it, but he said, why don't you come to my office? We'll sort of map out a storyline, and then you'll direct it. I said, yeah, you bet. So that was the idea going in, was that we would just do a 1-hour special. There was no thought to there being a series. And HBO, to their credit, after the series was handed in, before it even aired, called up Larry and said, how would you guys like to do a series based on this? And I remember Larry calling me up saying, what do you think? And again, with my work ethic, my first question was, well, how many episodes do they want? And Larry said, well, they want 13, but I think I can talk them down to 10. I said, all right, talk them down to 10, and I'm in. And again, I thought we would do one season. And I thought nobody would really get it except maybe our personal friends and maybe some family members. Probably not the family members, actually. And then it sort of caught on. And then there was a second season and a third and a fourth. And it went on for 8 seasons with still an open invitation from HBO to do as many more as Larry cares to do. So that was sort of a happy accident because I never saw myself, I never thought about series television as any kind of a career goal. I had done a series of documentaries, I had done some TV specials, that kind of thing, but was never that interested in series television. But this was such a fun way to do it. And again, Larry and I were pals, and we were sort of doing a different kind of television. It was exciting. It was fun for a long time.
So in Mr. Sloane, you have these very tightly wound, scripted, written episodes. And then in Curb Your Enthusiasm, you have no scripts other than outlines of what you're going to do.
Right.
Is that like being on a roller coaster every time you're shooting? I mean, do you ever get through a scene or you're in the middle of a scene going, oh my God, this is going somewhere I never expected?
Well, both ways of doing it have their challenges and they have their plus side too. I mean, it sounds funny to say that on Mr. Sloane, I really enjoyed the luxury of having a script, but I did, you know. They both sort of serve different, I don't know, they're both enjoyable in their own way. There's something about the excitement of being on the tightrope of, I won't say without a net, because your net is the editing room where you pick the best stuff. But there's something exciting about the improvisational element that we utilized in Curb, but something very reassuring about having scripts. And of course, even with a scripted show, if you're on the set and you feel a piece of dialogue isn't working, I always encourage my actors, you know, to change it up, or we'll afterwards we'll say, maybe there's a different way of doing this. You still have that opportunity to change things. It's not like you're locked into a script that's written in stone. Yeah, it's kind of nice. You can also, when something is scripted, you know, Curb was all handheld. We had 2 cameras going at any time, and it was shot sort of documentary style, where you would just follow the action and the cameras would try to stay out of each other's way. Whereas Sloane is a slicker kind of show with more production value, because once you have a script, you can anticipate beforehand how you choose to shoot something. And, you know, either you're on a dolly or, you know, you're on a jib or whatever, you can get some nice camera movement in there. And so that's nice, and you can plan your lighting a little better. So Sloane has a very different look to Curb, just because it's a more conventional show in terms of being a polished show, whereas Curb was very loosey-goosey and shot documentary style, and that had its own rewards.
You did a documentary on another comic genius.
Many comic geniuses. Which one are you?
Woody Allen.
Oh yeah, sure.
Could you tell me a little bit about what that was like?
Well, all of my documentaries have been about people whose work I grew up admiring. And many of these are leftover adolescent obsessions. When I was in junior high and high school, my personal Mount Rushmore were the Marx Brothers, first and foremost, Woody Allen, Lenny Bruce, and Kurt Vonnegut. And in my adult life, these have all been subjects of my documentaries. My first one, I was 22 years old. I did a documentary on the Marx Brothers for public television. And I went on to do one on W.C. Fields and Mort Saul. Lenny Bruce, again, was an obsession. That took 13 years to make, that film. My joke at the time was I didn't know whether to have the film released or bar mitzvahed. And then Woody Allen, I think I approached Woody initially probably soon after the Marx Brothers film, sometime in the earlier mid-'80s, trying to get him to authorize. You know, he's a very private guy, and he's very shy and does not think much of his own work. Frankly, doesn't think he's worthy of any kind of documentary tribute or anything like that. So I was so young at the time, I just thought, well, I'll keep going back to this guy every decade or so until he relents. And then finally, I think in 2008, I talked him into it. I mean, I wrote him a very convincing letter saying, it's time for this, and if I don't do it, someone's going to do a lousy version of it. So he agreed and gave me full access, and I followed him around on the set, and I was in the editing room with him, and I went to Cannes with him and did what wound up being not only a definitive documentary on him, also for public television, but was a two-parter. It was 3.5 hours because this guy's career has gone on for so long. He's done so much. It's sort of hard to keep it down to a conventional length. So that was a two-parter. And now I've broken my own record for the gestation period of a given documentary, because also soon after my Marx Brothers documentary in '82, I wrote a letter to my favorite author, Kurt Vonnegut, asking him for authorization for a documentary, which he gave me back in '82. I started filming with him in 1988, and this is primarily out of my own pocket, and continued filming with him on and off until shortly before his death in 2007. And I've been sitting on all this footage for a long time trying to figure out how to put this thing together, because the financing was never really there. I'd gone as far as I could go out of my own pocket. So as we speak, I'm 2 days past finishing a Kickstarter campaign for the film, where I successfully raised the financing to continue with the film. So that's going to be my big project this year, my long-awaited documentary called Kurt Vonnegut Unstuck in Time.
Well, it's going to be a wonderful film, I have no doubt, as has the body of your work been. And we're very, very happy to have Mr. Sloane on public television.
I am too. I'm thrilled to finally have it be seen in the States here, especially in Los Angeles.
And thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.